All right, moving on. I've got a bit of a brief research review segment here where I'm going to talk about two pieces of research that um, made some waves, generally got picked up by the media and then got, tossed around a little bit on social media, throwing the links and the headlines around. So I wanted to address these just because so many people have been talking about them. The first one I want to cover is another paper that's largely being attributed to Ponser, although I wouldn't necessarily call it a paper by Ponser necessarily. So, um, in the most recent episode, we talked about that paper where Ponser was the lead author, where they were looking at metabolism across the lifespan. So go back to the previous episode to get caught up to date on that particular research review. But in this case, it was the same group of researchers, but Ponser was not the lead author. In this case, he was the third author. But a lot of people are calling it the Ponser paper because he is an author. Third author, it usually indicates a very substantial contribution. So
Yeah.
I don't want to diminish that. But this is an idea that Ponser really popularized, and he's if there's one idea he's known for, it's the topic of this paper. So seeing his name in the top three on the marquee there, a lot of people are calling it the Ponser paper. To some extent, that's appropriate. But I have seen papers in the past, just being in academic publishing, where like you kind of know who did what on a project, and like the person who's like lead author did like 96% of it, and everybody's calling it like someone else's paper because they're like the most famous person on the paper, but they're like sixth out of 10.
Yeah,
And I'm just like, out of respect for the lead author, like, let's make sure we're giving credit there. But anyway, this paper came from that big group. They're using that data from the International Atomic Energy Agency doubly labeled water database. So this paper is by Carreau, Halsey, Ponser, and a whole bunch of other people that are associated with that huge group. And they've actually had quite a few papers coming out. I've seen at least 3 over the last couple weeks utilizing this database, which is awesome because this database is a really cool resource. I'm glad that people are making good use of it. So in this particular study, the previous one was looking at energy expenditure across the lifespan. This study is looking at energy compensation. So the general question here is, if somebody increases their exercise or their activity thermogenesis, if they're expending more energy from physical activity, are they going to compensate and reduce other components of energy expenditure, which really ties into Ponser's constrained energy expenditure model. The idea that, as you increase activity energy expenditure, other components of energy expenditure, such as resting energy expenditure, will get constrained to kind of offset that to some extent. And so you mentioned that a takeaway that a lot of people have had on the internet is like, because of this study, we now know that exercise doesn't increase your energy expenditure, like your total.
That's a take that I've seen with alarming levels of frequency.
Yeah. So 2 specific instances where I've seen this is, we use activity level correction factors in the macro factor diet app when trying to estimate when you're just getting started and we don't have any data from you. It's our kind of estimation process for your starting energy expenditure. We do have a correction factor for physical activity. And so some people have asked, why even bother? And another thing that's come up that I've seen is, just the general question, does this mean that exercise is useless in a weight loss program? Now, with this particular paper, they used the data from that big data set. In this case, they had over 1,700 participants because they could only use data where they had the doubly labeled water information for total daily energy expenditure, but they also had resting energy expenditure measured via indirect calorimetry. So they didn't have that for every single individual in this data set. With the last paper had like 6,000 participants or something like that. In this case, we're talking about 1,700, which is more than your typical caffeine study for sure.
Yeah.
Exercise science, we're usually looking at like 20 or 30 people. So 1,700
if we're lucky.
If we're lucky, yes. So 1,700 is a lot.
Get 8 subjects, just say like, yeah, it's a pilot study.
Yeah, it's fine. And so what they found here was that the average energy compensation that was observed in this data set on average was about 28%. And so what that means is, when people tried to, increase their activity energy expenditure or increase their energy expenditure via physical activity, only about 72% of those extra calories really got added on to the total daily energy expenditure. So if they tried to increase their energy expenditure by increasing 100 calories of physical activity, their total daily energy expenditure would only go up by about 72 rather than 100.
So I just need to fact check something real quick.
Sure.
72% is a different number than 0%, right?
Traditionally,
Okay.
yeah. So basically, what that indicates, again, that's the average there. So what that tells us is, people who are increasing their physical activity, trying to burn some extra calories, they think they're increasing it by 100 calories, but in
Mhm.
reality, it's only going up by what I say about 72, because
Mhm.
there's this 28% that's being compensated by reducing things like resting energy expenditure, either from basal energy expenditure or potentially a contribution from non-exercise activity as well. So reducing those basal processes, reducing non-exercise activity, those could be contributing to this compensation effect. Now, the effects were similar for males and females. They were similar for young participants and old participants, but they did seem to differ based on body composition. So people that were in the 10th percentile of the BMI distribution compensated to a magnitude of about 27, 28%. But when they looked at the 90th percentile, there was a compensation of about 49%. That's a pretty drastic difference going from the people with lower body weight to the people with higher body weight. And so, definitely, that would reinforce this concept that people who are on the higher end of the BMI spectrum have a greater degree of compensation. So when they tried to increase their energy expenditure through 100 calories of physical activity, total daily energy expenditure only went up by about half that rather than the entire 100 calories, just as a representative example. So the one thing that this paper cannot answer due to the observational nature is what's going on there? Is it the idea that as you increase adiposity and accumulate more weight and more body fat, does that increase compensation in a causative way? Or is it more likely that people who compensate more are more predisposed to accumulating more body weight and body fat across the lifetime? Since it's observational, we can't say which comes first in that kind of causative change. And we also can't rule out the possibility that something completely different is kind of contributing there. But if I had to guess, I think it's more likely that individuals who have a high degree of compensation are probably more predisposed to accumulating more body fat over time. If I had to guess, that would be where my money is at. But again, with an observational study like this, we can't really say necessarily which one comes first.
Yeah, so this is purely anecdotal. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a little bit of both, though.
Yeah.
Um, like as someone who has been quite large and also considerably smaller, my experience has been that just being like wiped out from exercise, training, whatever, did affect me less when I weighed less. And I think part of that is just simply like, dude, if you got more of yourself that you need to get up off the couch, it's a little bit harder to get up off the couch.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I obviously wasn't doing like W labeled water experiments on myself
You
for
should have, though.
continuously for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
But I think you are correct that it is more that people who are predisposed to be larger probably do just inherently have larger compensations. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's a little of column A and a little of column B, just based on my own experience.
Yeah, totally possible. So hopefully, we'll get to the bottom of that in the future
Yeah.
with more research. So now you're totally caught up to speed on the whole series of papers that have really caught the attention of the fitness industry out of that group. And again, the important thing to emphasize here, the compensation was not 100%. It is not the case that, you know, you would look at this paper, look at the results and say, oh, I guess exercise doesn't increase total daily energy expenditure.
That really has been one of the more confusing series of takes that I've seen on social media, probably ever, honestly.
Wow, that's
No,
pretty.
like if you've been alive in the world ever and used your eyes, it should be clear that exercising a lot does increase the amount of calories you burn to some degree. You
Yeah.
know, like
I mean, yeah,
if
if
you if
you
you've been on this earth for long enough to generate observations, that should be painfully obvious. That is a more painful take to me than just about anything I've ever seen.
yeah, and I mean, the thing that I thought of is like if you've ever hung out with an endurance athlete during a really high volume stretch of their training, they eat a bagel every 20 minutes.
Mhm.
Like they are just consuming calories throughout the day, nonstop, and notoriously pretty slim endurance athletes. I mean,
Typically,
it's a pretty notable observation when you're like, dude, do you ever stop eating? And it's like, yeah, I ran like 40 miles this week. I'm pretty hungry, you
yeah.
know? That is that even a high volume for endurance athletes?
That would be a high volume for like a recreational
Yeah.
runner.
Yeah.
The pros are typically, I mean, it depends what distance you're talking about, but
Yeah.
generally 70 plus,
Whew,
sometimes topping 100.
that's a lot. All right. So the other study that I wanted to mention here, my headline is the fake news vilification of hot dogs from a state up north. So this is research coming out of Michigan, and we're not very fond of those individuals during football season because this is a strong Ohio State football podcast. We have not locked down that sponsorship yet, but we are working diligently. So this is a study out of the University of Michigan, and it caught a lot of headlines because the kind of easy takeaway was that a hot dog reduces your healthy lifespan by like 36 minutes, give or take. Um, and so, first of all, I want us to accept that at face value and kind of suspend any skepticism we might have. So, if one hot dog reduces your healthy lifespan by 36 minutes, um, and you said, you know what, I don't care. I really like hot dogs. I'm going to eat 4 a week for my entire life because it just means a lot to me, you know? So, unless I messed up my numbers, I'm pretty certain that 4 hot dogs a week at 36 minutes a pop, if you continue that habit for 70 years of your life, you would lose 1 year on the back end. Uh, Seems like a not that bad of a trade-off to me personally. I mean, I don't eat hot dogs anymore due to my path to enlightenment, but yeah, I mean that's not as catastrophic when you start to actually put some numbers to it and say, oh, that's not particularly scary.
Yeah.
Now, that's if we suspend our skepticism. I'm just going to be honest. I have like a personal bias here with this type of thing. I just really dislike metrics that lack face validity. Like, because I don't think you would actually walk up to somebody in the field of nutrition to say, like, do you truly believe this statement? If you eat a hot dog, it reduces your lifespan by 36 minutes. I don't actually believe anyone would say, I actually believe that in a literal way.
Hmm.
And so my perspective is, you know, we're trying to, I assume, quantify these things to make them more tangible. But if we don't actually believe that tangible quantification, I just don't see why we really bother with these things.
Hmm.
I don't think it's particularly helpful or useful, but that's my personal opinion. I'm sure a lot of really smart folks disagree with me on that. But I looked into the paper. The scoring system for how we arrive at this seemed a little bit opaque to me. So I dug a little deeper and found a dissertation document by one of the authors of this paper. And within the dissertation document, if you've ever opened up a dissertation, they're long and they have like 70 tables in them. You know, it's like all this, like the paper that results from it is like the highlight reel. You
Yeah.
know, the dissertation is like usually like 200 pages, 36 appendices. It's long. So there was all the details in there about how the scoring system works. A couple things that jumped out to me.
Can I just throw out a really hot take?
Sure.
So this is adjacent to something we've talked about on the podcast before, how there's so many low impact publications that come out every year just due to like publisher perish type pressures. I actually kind of think that dissertations rock, and that's how like most research should be done. Just pump out like one dissertation quality thing per year. Boom, great. And like obviously that wouldn't make sense for an individual to do now. One, because journals wouldn't publish it, word count limits, etc. And two, because even if you have one high impact pub a year, generally that's going to be looked poorly upon if people you're competing against have 15 lower impact pubs. Uh, but I think in a perfect world, most research documents would look a lot more like theses or dissertations, just because, like you're describing, they're so much more thorough. You know, oftentimes when you're reading an individual paper, you will have questions after you read the method section, which should not be the case. Like the theoretical purpose of a method section is if someone wanted to perfectly replicate your study, they could. And like that's kind of rare, I think,
Yeah.
for a method section to actually be that thorough. You almost always see that in dissertations. Um, and then often like there's a logical flow to them. Like they might include two, three, four experiments that all build on each other. So you can kind of see how an idea develops and multiple layers of evidence supporting whatever concept it is. So I think in a perfect world, that's how most science would be done and communicated. Um, anyway, you mentioned dissertations. I just wanted to slide that in there. Uh, you can keep going.
All right, will do. So, so yeah, basically, I took a quick look at the scoring system. A couple things that jumped out to me were it was pretty punitive for sodium, and it was a little bit punitive for red meat as well.
Mhm.
And those are kind of those things where when you start to look at how these quantifications work, they peel away a lot of the context of the specific food item and the overall construction of the diet. They try to boil it down to kind of basic contributing factors, and sometimes it's not super helpful to do that, so like if you have a high sodium food in the context of a diet that isn't particularly high in sodium, or you're an exerciser, you have a lot of sweat loss, or you're not particularly sodium sensitive when it comes to your blood pressure response to diet, like some of these things start to really break down in more nuanced applications. So anyway, these types of scoring systems, I don't really know if I support the general premise. And even if you do, they tend to get pretty overly reductionist, and you run into situations where some foods can have kind of unexpected results within the scoring system based on their various components. So one of the other things that jumped out to me here is I'm not really fond of the concept of treating risks as these like perfectly linear things where you do it once and your lifespan shortens, you do it twice, your lifespan shortens more. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about probability here. You could do something that is carcinogenic, and if you do that for your entire lifespan and never end up developing cancer as a result of that behavior, your lifespan did not shorten due to that thing, despite the fact that it is known to be carcinogenic. I mean, you would want to avoid that if possible, but I don't know if I like this approach. I mean, this is probably how like actuary tables work, right?
Mhm.
But
I
yeah, I
mean,
mean,
if you play Russian roulette 6 consecutive times with a single revolver, you will die, but you don't become 1/6 dead every
exactly,
time.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's something to keep in mind is like this whole approach to the scoring system and the way it's treated as this kind of perfectly linear thing in the headlines. I'm not super fond of. Now, this sounds super critical. I don't want to just like bash the paper because it is work that is done well. With people like this stuff, and this is a suitable way to do nutrition, kind of like epidemiological nutrition science. So this is just me being a little bit contrarian, just because you see these headlines that people run away with, and you're like, I understand the headline and where it comes from, but I don't believe that anyone actually believes that. So if you're curious about why you kept seeing those headlines, that's pretty much where this comes from. But this particular paper did not introduce new evidence new empirical evidence about risks associated with actually consuming hot dogs. They basically said, hot dog, okay, we've got, super refined bread, we've got high sodium, we've got processed meat, check, 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 36 minutes. So that's where this came from. And I don't put a whole lot of stock. I mean, hot dog is not a particularly healthful food. We knew that before this study. We know that after. The 36-minute component is very arbitrary, in my opinion. Now, there was an interesting aspect of this paper that looked at the environmental impact of foods. And it did the same kind of approach where it tried to assign a score, use some scoring systems to talk about how choosing a particular food might impact the environment. Now, I don't have the skill set to really assess that type of scoring system. I'm not an environmental scientist, but an important thing to note is that these authors are environmental scientists. Part of me, if you look at the paper and say, you know what, the health and nutrition stuff, let's table that for a moment. And I just want to look at the environmental impact stuff. I would have to assume that the environmental impact stuff is potentially a little bit more rigorous and robust and applicable than the nutrition side, because this PhD was done in environmental health sciences. So that part of the paper was probably more squarely within their wheelhouse rather than specifically looking at like nutritional science or something like that. I'm just guessing, but it was an interesting paper to look at some of the environment related ramifications of choosing a variety of different foods. So if you're interested in that, it's a cool paper for that. Like I said, I don't have the skill set to really assess those environmental scores, but that is a rundown of the papers that have been in the headlines.